Good day. I'm Joanna Catron. I'm the Assistant Director and Curator at Gari Melchers Home and Studio here in Falmouth, Virginia. And thank you for joining our program, The Return of Winter, how federal law enforcement, with the assistance of a private foundation, recovered Nazi looted art. We are really excited to present a topic which has captured the attention of the media of late, an art crime investigation involving the Third Reich, the ongoing consequences for victims of that regime, and reparations made one step at a time that have resulted from this investigation and investigations like it. Here is your opportunity to hear a full recounting of the recovery of the painting called Winter by Gari Melchers. We have an expert lineup of speakers, all of whom played a critical role in righting a grievous wrong. I will say that we will have time at the end of the program for you to air your comments and questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point during the program. We will begin with opening remarks provided by Acting United States Attorney, Northern District of New York, Antoinette Baker, and FBI Special Agent in Charge, Thomas Redford. Next, I will introduce the painting's backstory, followed by our other special guests, Roger Strauch, President of the Maza Foundation, Eric Bartko, Project Manager for the Maza Art Restitution Project and Director of Investigations for Bartko, Zankel, Bunzel, and Miller. Christopher Moran follows, Assistant United States Attorney, Northern District of New York, who litigated the case. And finally, FBI Special Agent Christopher McKeogh, a member of the FBI's Elite Art Crimes Unit based in New York City. It is now my pleasure to welcome Antoinette Bacon.
Thank you so much. And to everyone listening, warmest greetings from Albany, New York. Serving as the acting United States Attorney is a deep honor and a responsibility. It is a responsibility to ensure that justice is done each and every day, that injustices do not stand, no matter how long ago they might have been committed, and to try to restore that sense of justice to victims and to survivors. I feel that every day in every case, and I'm thrilled that we were able to provide a measure of restitution to the Maza family who suffered a great injustice many years ago. Rudolf Maza, his daughter, and her husband, they operated a well-known and successful publishing company in Berlin during the early part of the 20th century. They were Jewish, and the Nazi Party targeted them for who they were and for the negative press they were writing in their newspapers. Faced with imminent persecution, the Maza family fled Germany, leaving all of their property, including an extensive art collection. The Nazis confiscated essentially all of the family property, including the painting Winter. Members of the Maza family made their way to America, and coincidentally, so did Winter. The injustices of the Holocaust are beyond comprehension. I cannot begin to describe them adequately. No one can ever restore the lives, the families, the communities that the Nazis destroyed, and there is no such thing as just compensation for the atrocities of the Holocaust. The Maza family lost nearly everything because they were Jewish, but they didn't lose hope, and neither did the Department of Justice. The FBI has a program dedicated to finding and returning stolen art and cultural property, and Winter is one of the latest examples of the FBI's success. We were delighted to be part of the team to return Winter to its rightful owners. And while I know that this certainly did not take away the pain the Mosses endured, I hope it provided the family with some sense of justice. And it should also serve as a reminder to crime victims that my team in the Northern District of New York and my colleagues throughout the Department of Justice are committed to doing our very best every day to secure restitution for victims, no matter how long that might take. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, the Special Agent in charge of the FBI for the Northern District of New York, Thomas Redford.
Great, good morning, and thank you, Toni, well said. And thank you, Joanna, for putting on this great presentation today. So I just want to give out a few thanks first to the folks at Gari Melchers' home at the University of Mary Washington, Virginia, for inviting us to participate in this great event today. Cases like this are so important to highlight that they are only possible thanks to the strong partnerships we have with our U.S. Attorney's Office and the private sector like the Mossa Foundation. This case was successful because of the hard work of AUSA Chris Moran and retired agent Joanne Seals and Gary McMullen, who's a task force officer with us from the Albany County Sheriff's Office. I'd also like to shout out and thank Special Agent Chris McKeogh for the Art Crimes Unit down in New York City for his support and guidance. Chris does a fantastic work with the Art Crimes Unit, and I'm sure you're going to get a chance to listen to him and hear about what he did on this case. So thank you, Chris. Our office is immensely proud to have played a small role in this effort to locate and return art stolen from by the Nazis during World War II. We're truly honored to be part of such inspiring work. So again, thank you so much for allowing the FBI to be part of this. And Joanne, I'll turn it back to you to start the presentation.
Thank you, Toni and Thomas. Appreciate it. All right, first slide, please. Gari Melchers was an internationally renowned American painter of portraits, scenes of everyday life, and landscapes. Active from the 1880s until his death in 1932, he was an expatriate, dividing his time between Paris, Holland, and Weimar Germany until the outbreak of the First World War. At that time, he returned to the United States, headquartering himself in Manhattan with his country retreat located here at Belmont, today the Gari Melchers home and studio in Falmouth, Virginia. You're looking at a photo on the left of the screen, Gari Melchers, photographed about 1912, and the interior view of his studio here at Belmont. If you have not been here, a visit to Belmont is a must. Belmont is one of the best preserved artist homes and studios anywhere. So, Melchers was a commercial success, particularly in Germany, where over the years he earned the steady patronage of museums, industrialists like the Krupps, a number of prominent businessmen like Georg Hahn, and the German-American exporter Hugo Reisinger, who was an art collector and left his sizable collection to Harvard University. Next slide, please. In 1899, Gari Melchers exhibited 2 pictures at the Art Institute of Chicago's 12th Annual Exhibition of American Artists. One of those is Winter. Listed here on the left in his personal ledger, 4th line up from the bottom, Winter is given as a pastel. As it did not sell, and actually it was also in Paris at the Salon that year too, it did not sell there, he exhibited the following year at the Great Berlin Art Exhibition of 1900, listed 4th from the bottom in a typed sales list provided by the exhibition organizers, the list to the right of the screen. He did sell Winter at Berlin and amended his ledger to identify the purchaser, again in the bottom line now of his ledger as P. Mazza. He wasn't quite accurate. It was corrected in the sales list to the right, R. Mazza. provided by the exhibition organizers. So these two documents are important in the paper trail establishing the history of ownership for this painting. Next slide, please. The image at the left, by the way, is winter. A little investigation led me to the possibility that it was Rudolf Maza, publisher of the Berliner Tageblatt, that was the purchaser in question. The Berliner Tageblatt, as we've heard from Toni, was the foremost German newspaper of the day. And so clearly Maza was a highly prominent and moneyed individual, although his purchase here was fairly modest. The notation 1400 in Melchers' ledger, I believe, refers to German marks in the year 1900, equivalent to about 330 American dollars, today approximately $10,300. Next slide, please. Winter, again at the left, pictures a young couple traversing a snowy village landscape with their skates and a skating stick. That skating stick enabled couples to skate in tandem. Melchers cribbed Winter in a slightly altered form from his earlier success entitled Skaters, pictured at the right. Skaters was painted in oil, not pastel, around 1893 and purchased by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. In addition to medium, the other differences between the two are in the coloration and the direction of the man's gaze. Next slide, please. There is yet a third closely related version of Skaters at it is at Belmont, and it's pictured at the right. It began life as a tracing taken by Melchers directly from his painting Skaters at the left, and it survives in a much less finished state than even Winter. Next slide, please. So if my hunch was correct, that our Maza was in fact Rudolf Maza, who is pictured here at the left, and that he is the purchaser of Winter, his name became parenthetical in my mind, for the picture appeared to me as having the same fate as a lot of personal property, that it was probably passed down through family or out of a family entirely and into someone else's hands, and in this case, to an American art museum many decades ago. I didn't give Maza much more thought until years later when I learned about the Maza Foundation and the work of its art restitution project, and thus began the next chapter for Winter. Roger Strauch, I turn it over to you. Roger is the president of the Maza Foundation.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Joanna, for hosting all of us today. Good morning, everybody. Well, I am the step-great-grandson of Rudolf Maza. Rudolf Maza actually passed away 101 years ago. But as you've just learned, he was a very distinguished and very successful industrialist and philanthropist in Germany over 100 years ago. He distinguished himself by doing something that we can all relate to today. He came up with the idea of selling advertising in newspapers so that he would be able to charge less for the newspaper to subscribers, and as a result get a larger subscription base and be able to sell more advertising. What are we doing on the internet today? So he became one of the wealthiest people in all of Germany and one of the 3 wealthiest families in Berlin. He died in 1920. As a very accomplished philanthropist as well. And the person who took over ultimately is my step-grandfather, Hans Lachmann Maza. And During that time period, Hans Lachmann Masse continued the Masse tradition of being an active community philanthropist supporting artistic endeavors, endeavors to enhance the welfare of economically disadvantaged people, and supporting educational ventures. Well, as you've just learned, they owned the Berliner Tagblatt, which was kind of like the New York Times of Germany. It was the leading progressive voice in Germany. And it was an outspoken critic and opponent of the rise of the National Socialist movement, Nazis. And as a result, when the Nazis took over in 1933, the family was targeted. But and Hitler and Goebbels used the Masse name, vilified the Masse name more than 20 times publicly. I believe it was more than any other Jewish family was named in their speeches. The property, by that time, the family had to leave and quickly exiled out of Germany, and their property was expropriated by Goebbels and Göring personally. And it was, along with the Wertheimer family, the first two serious expropriation efforts, and in a process that then became a well-oiled machine for confiscating Jewish property. Well, I am representing, as the leader of the Masse Art Restitution Project, 3 heirs: the University of Wisconsin, a nonprofit foundation that my brother and I are responsible for, and a private individual who remains quite private. All of these entities, either institutions or people, are direct heirs of Rudolf Masse. In our nonprofit case, the one my brother and I are responsible for, it is through my aunt, who was a grandchild of Rudolf Masse. And then University of Wisconsin, it's through my uncle George, who was a distinguished professor and also a grandchild of Rudolf Masse. And he was a distinguished professor at University of Wisconsin. My father was a step grandchild, and he was a professor at Harvard. All 3 of these people, my aunt, a psychiatrist, first Caucasian psychiatrist to work in Harlem, my uncle, and her work was cited by Thurgood Marshall in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. My uncle, a distinguished history professor at University of Wisconsin, and my dad became chairman of Harvard's physics department, all came over with not very much, and started lives as middle class professionals. I did not know about my past until I was about 12 or 13 years old, when my parents started, and my uncle and aunt started telling us about it. Why am I representing the heirs in this project? Why am I doing this project? My family asked me that 10 years ago when we took it on. Because one, it does seem the right thing to do to restitute property that was taken away from the family illegally. And it's an adventure in learning about one's family and past, and an adventure in meeting new people, not the least of whom are the people on this call who one can admire and appreciate in what they do. And it has lived up to that expectation. Along the way, I had the privilege of engaging a team, a father-son team, a lawyer, John Bartko, and his son, Eric Bartko, who leads the investigation. He's on this presentation, will follow me. I interviewed lots of people for this job, one of whom was depicted in the movie Women in Gold, which is very much about this process that we're talking about today, which starred Helen Mirren, a pretty good movie, actually. And I've been very fortunate to have chosen a fantastic team to lead what has been an investigation that spans Europe, Asia, and the United States, and has cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars. We have over 1,000 objects we're looking for and are listed on the internet. We've recovered 3 dozen. We've done 3 dozen restitutions, 50 objects, and we have a long way to go. And it is one of the most, it is probably one of the most ambitious Nazi art restitution projects in the world. And what is our objective? Our objective is not only to restore the ownership to the heirs of these artifacts, this property, but also to renew an interest in the Mosse name in Germany and in the academic world more broadly, because he was actually more than leading a Reformed Jewish leader. He was actually mainly a German industrialist. He was most proud, ironically, of being a German. And that meant everything to him. And it showed in his work and how he gave away his money. So we are trying to restore this property, and we're trying to renew the interest in the Mosse name. What are the guiding principles of this project? Well, tenacity and sensitivity with purpose, with the purpose that I just stated. And what am I learning? Well, I'm learning what one would expect to learn. There are a lot of good people on this planet, and there are a lot of not so good people on this planet, or have not. And I have learned something totally new, which is in Germany, there is a community of provenance researchers who are remarkably talented people, who are at once investigators and historians, who care deeply about helping identify the past history of an artifact in a way that is factual. And these people are a community that most Americans wouldn't be so familiar with provenance researchers. In Germany, it's a kind of big deal to be a distinguished one, and we've had a chance to meet many of them, and it's been a real privilege. It's also been a privilege to appreciate the services of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I cannot tell you how much we admire the people who serve us as public servants, and how grateful we are for your tremendous talents and work. I do want to tell you about one kind of sort of amusing / creepy story that I had on this project. We conducted a seminar in Berlin for people who were interested in learning about how we go about doing our art restitution efforts, and also learning about how they're thinking about it. And apparently somebody heard that I was hosting this event, and flew from Zurich with his daughter, and presented himself to me and introduced himself as essentially my enemy. He said that I know where a lot of your art is, and I have no intention of helping you. In fact, I'm discouraging anybody that I know from telling you that they have your art or they know where it is, because it's been gone a long time from your family, and you don't have any right to it. And he had come just to say that to me to my face. I thought that was a pretty interesting life experience. With that, I will turn the program back to Joanna, and thank you. One last thing, I do want to acknowledge, besides acknowledging the tremendous talent of the Albany office of the Department of Justice, the FBI had in that office a tremendous agent, Agent Alphen, who's unfortunately His life was lost earlier this month. He was one of the two agents that were shot and killed in, I believe it was Florida, serving a warrant. And I want to honor him, as I do all the members of the Albany office, for their tremendous public service, and wish him, his family, well under tremendously difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you very much for the dedication of your foundation and the important work you do to give victims and their heirs hope that reparations can and will be made. Next up is Eric Bardco, Project Manager for the Maza Art Restitution Project. Eric.
Thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure to be here today. And having worked with the FBI in the Northern District of New York in the restitution of the Melchers painting winner, I too would like to add my condolences to Mr. Strauch in regard to Agent Alphen. It's a great tragedy. The FBI is a tremendous and positive piece of a very significant and just legal system on the planet. It happens to belong to the United States of America. Particularly a great example of that, the difference between our legal system and a great deal of the rest of the world. It was the involvement of the Northern District of New York and the FBI in the restitution of Winter. In the United States, stolen property is a big deal. That is not true in Europe. Most of Europe, possession transfers in relatively swift periods of time simply through possession. And this is one of the great hurdles which is faced by Jewish families seeking the restitution of art post-World War II. Simply having had it for a period of time results in private individuals who have, under the laws of the nations in which they live, legitimate title under those legal systems to that property. It remains stolen, but they have legitimate title to it. And it creates enormous hurdles and difficulties in which one must find a common space in which to discuss with those individuals and convince them that the right thing to do is to restitute the property. There have been various stages in the restitution of property over time since the end of World War II. Many of you may be familiar with the film The Monuments Men. During the course of the war, they tracked and retrieved art, and at the post-end of the war, it was divided into three major centers for the collection of the art. And basically, based on the limited manpower available, the United States was faced with returning the art to the countries from which it had originated. And they simply weren't able to go all the way back to, well, which family and which country did this originate from? And we must get it back to that family. And it's simply beyond their manpower and ability, which was soon followed by the beginning of the Cold War, which resulted in the system they had put together becoming a program run by West Germany. And during that process, there are all kinds of complaints that can be made about justice and whether they were doing the right thing. But the reality is they collected a tremendous amount of art after the war, and they at the very least returned to the countries from which it had originated. In the case of Winter, it's very interesting. The Mosse family, as Roger noted, Rudolf Mosse was proud of himself as an industrialist. And at the beginning of the Nazi regime, one of the things people don't remember is that Hitler became chancellor, but his power was not incredibly solid immediately. The wars don't begin for several years. And in 1933, when he becomes chancellor, the laws do not exist in the German code to enable gross, flagrant expropriation of property from Jewish families. And one of the interesting things about the example of Rudolf Mosse is that They had to undergo legal machinations. They had come up with a reason under the current legal code, which enabled them to expropriate the entire company from the family, and in the process also take the art collection. And it has left a confused historical event. There are many, many museums, and I've talked with many, oh, well, that's, yeah, we do have that painting, but you know what? I mean, didn't Rudolf Moss, didn't they go bankrupt? This happened in 1933. What's the problem? At which case we marched forward with a great deal of history and explained to them the circumstances under which the company was expropriated by the German government. In the case of Winter, it's very interesting. Over the course of almost a decade now of researching Mossy art, we've developed deep and significant connections with inside the German government. And to our great good fortune, at about the end of 2017, those connections allowed us to begin a research program based in Germany at the Free University and funded by the German government for specifically to research Mossy art. It's known as the Mossy Art Research Initiative, and it's at Free University. It's run by Mikey Hoffman. And in the course of their early research, they discovered, and of all places, a very small world moment, there was an announcement on Facebook that Winter would be on display at the Arkell Museum. And it was an effort to drum up attendance for an exhibition at the museum. And since they understood what was in the collection, they knew about the painting, and they asked some pointed questions. I said, well, gosh, you know, is there a sticker on the back of that painting referring to the Berlin exhibition in 1900? And the museum wrote back, why, yes, there is. And here's a photograph of it. At which point we were 99% certain that we were speaking about the same painting that Rudolf Mossy had indeed purchased at the Berlin exhibition in 1900. As Joanna noted in her introduction to the program earlier and displayed slides of. At that point, we understood that we were going to seek a restitution. And while we notified the museum that we believed they were in possession of stolen property, we also undertook to seek the guidance of the Northern District of New York. Because we, you know, as professionals, we understand the laws of the United States of America take stolen property seriously, and that while, say, in Europe, we would have to seek some kind of interim understanding or demonstrate to them some sort of moral culpability which would enable them to decide that, and this is most often the case of public institutions, that the Washington Principles, which originated in 1998, which do not control museum behavior, but influence museum behavior, suggest that just and fair solutions be found. Fortunately for us in the United States, the Washington Principles are not the only event, and certainly not the only law that controls stolen property in the United States. And we reached out to the Northern District of New York, where we were very fortunate to come into contact with Christopher Moran, who you can see here today, and Christopher McKeogh. And in the process, they, rather than simply saying, we're going to do something for you, they, as representatives of our legal system, they said, well, share with us the information you have about this painting. Why is it that you're asking us for our advice? And we shared with them the provenance research, which we had done and which had been done by Mari. And we allowed the US legal, you know, they made their own decisions about what they thought was appropriate to do with that information. Eventually, that resulted in the Northern District of New York making the decision to reach out to Arkell and negotiate the return of the painting. And one can describe it in any way you want, in different ways. One is that they contacted the museum and the museum relinquished their rights. You could also describe it as, you know, under the law, it's known as confiscation. But the Northern District of New York took it upon itself that having been shown and had the information demonstrated to them that this property was stolen, that they would indeed obtain the property and then create a process wherein the legitimate previous owner of it could seek to claim it. That is something that should be noted, that happens in the United States. That doesn't happen in Europe. It doesn't happen in Israel either. We've retrieved art from many pieces from Germany, Austria, Israel, and the United States now. But the most clear, and I would say righteous system under which that property can be obtained exists in the United States. And the FBI has undertaken through its art crimes unit to retrieve Nazi looted art on behalf of both countries and individuals. And it's something I should be incredibly proud of. At this point, I think I'm going to go ahead and relinquish my time to the next individual, which I believe is going to be Christopher Moran, and let him speak about how his office made the decision and took the actions that they took. I can only say that the Mossy Art Restitution Project and the Mossy Art Research Initiative, which I initially identified the work, are incredibly fortunate to have been able to work with the United States Department of Justice and our Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning. My name is Chris Moran. I'm an assistant United States attorney in the Northern District of New York, and I had the privilege of handling this case for the United States. Under a federal law known as the National Stolen Property Act, also known as the Interstate Transportation of Stolen Property Statute, it is a crime to knowingly possess property that traveled in interstate commerce and that is worth more than $5,000. As Eric alluded to, there's no such thing as clear title to stolen property in the United States. Here, we had pretty compelling evidence that the Nazi Party took Winter from its rightful owner, the Mosse family, that it crossed international boundaries when it traveled from Germany and ultimately arrived in upstate New York at a small museum known as the Arkell Museum. We also knew that Winter was very likely worth more than $5,000. When the FBI presented that information to the Arkell Museum, the Arkell promptly signed over all rights to Winter, and the FBI took possession of Winter. Now, since Winter was stolen, it is also subject to a procedure called asset forfeiture. Under the civil asset forfeiture laws, we filed a lawsuit against the property itself, which places the property under the court's jurisdiction to decide what's going to happen to it. Anyone with a claim to the property has the opportunity to file a claim and be heard by an impartial judge as to why that person believes they should get the property. And that's exactly what happened here. In October 2019, we filed a lawsuit entitled The United States of America versus one painting entitled Winter. Only one party filed a claim, the Mosse Foundation, and the United States government was proud to return Winter to its rightful owner at a repatriation ceremony in October 2020. I'll now turn it over to Special Agent Chris McKeogh of the FBI's Art Crime Squad based in New York City. Special Agent McKeogh provided the expertise to handle this case, and we'll talk about how this case is just one of many, demonstrating that no matter how long it takes, the United States will not rest until justice is done. Chris?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to everybody for having me here. My name is Chris McKeogh. I'm a special agent with the FBI in New York. I work in New York City office. I'm a member of the FBI's art crime team, and there are about 20 to 25 of us spread throughout the country, which might sound like a lot, but when you consider that the FBI employs, I want to say roughly 12,000 agents, we have about 20 of us that work art crime matters. In some of the smaller offices, that is an as-needed basis. So they have other responsibilities and other cases that they work. For myself and maybe two others, this is a full-time job. It's all that I do. And New York being the art crime capital of the world, we're extremely busy. So a little bit about what we do and who we are. So what type of cases do we work? We work traditional thefts, we work forgeries, fraud matters, money laundering cases, arts and antiquity matters, looted antiquities, and money laundering matters as well. So in that as well are Nazi looted art cases that we spend a good amount of our time here in New York working on. And people are often surprised to say, well, it's been so long, it's been 80 years. How is the FBI working all these Holocaust restitution cases, Nazi looted art? And when you hear the stories about how many of these objects are still missing and how many were stolen, it's very difficult to imagine the scale of this theft. I'll give you an example. There was a victim who we recovered 2 items for a few years ago, and we were able to repatriate them to the family. And I had asked the family during the repatriation ceremony, well, how many are still missing and how many have you recovered? And they said, well, we're missing over 400 and these are the first 2. So it's amazing to think that 80 years has passed, and in a lot of ways, we're just getting started. There's a lot more out there and a lot more work to do, and the FBI never gives up on these cases. So that's what we're here to do, to try to right a little bit of a wrong and see if we can reunite some of these paintings with the heirs of the victims. So where do our cases come from? They come from our liaison contacts at museums and auction houses, galleries. They come from state and local law enforcement. They come from our foreign counterparts. They also come from our own research and from the public. The art crime team is following the news and seeing what stories are out there. And we rely on the public to provide information to us. If there is a crime that has been committed and there are people that have information to share, we always appreciate that information. A lot of times we rely on those sources to help us out, to let us know that a crime has been committed. And that's something that we can look into. So once we establish some information, we think that a crime is been committed, we'll reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'll reach out to people like Chris Moran and say, look, we believe that a crime has been committed here. We need to take a look at this. And if the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI are in agreement that a crime has been committed, we'll open an investigation and we'll look into it further. Why do we get involved in something like this? Somebody once said that my job as a special agent is to learn the truth. When somebody like Mr. Bartko comes to the FBI and says, this painting was stolen, we believe we've located it, it's my job to learn the truth and to find out what happened. With cases like Nazi looted art, it can be very difficult and very challenging because so much time has passed. And there are a lot of instances where Nazi looted art can be hiding in plain sight. It can be hanging on the wall of a museum. It could be hanging in somebody's house. And that owner could very likely not know about the history of the painting. It's passed through multiple hands. It's passed through multiple countries and generations of family members, potentially. And also you have to consider that in the days and years after and during the war, there were parties that were taking extraordinary steps to obscure the history of those artworks. So they would fake the provenance or eliminate some lines from a provenance in order to say, well, there's no issue with this. It's rightfully owned. So one of the things that we look for in provenance, and I sometimes think of myself as a glorified provenance researcher. I always feel that there's a lot of stories in the documentation related to an artwork. There's 2 things. There's the artwork itself. And in this case, this is a very interesting matter where the front of a painting is always very interesting and exciting. And that's where all the talent is. But for me as an investigator, all of the interesting things are on the back. There are stamps and there are all sorts of different markings. And one of the things that we look for with Holocaust restituted art is a historical photo. And it surprises a lot of people to know that the Nazis were impeccable record keepers. So when they seized an artwork, they filed a paper. When they transferred that artwork, they filed another paper. They photographed it, they measured it, and they kept step-by-step procedures of where this artwork was. And here in the 21st century, we're at a point where the technology is so incredible that a lot of these databases are online. They're available to the public. There's the Jeu de Paume website. It's called the ERR project, where the public can go online and look at these historical documents, look at the images. As an investigator, it helps us out tremendously, because where in years past, we might have to reach out to our French counterparts and wait for a response back. Now we can go on the internet, search the forms ourselves, and things happen a lot quicker. So we also look for gaps in provenance. So for example, if we are aware that a painting was likely located on the European continent during World War II, there is an extra responsibility for those in the industry to do that extra layer of due diligence to find out where was this painting during the war, and was it in the hands of those who stole or looted it. And a lot of times we find that provenance is missing for those war years. You'll have sales in the 10s or 20s, and then there'll be a gap and it shows up in New York in 1960. And it's my responsibility to figure out where was it during those years. We have very good liaisons and partners that we work with in the private sector, whether it be through universities or artist foundations or auction houses, that will help us with this research and to uncover the truth about where these paintings have been and what the situation is. And there are situations like here we are today where we can take a small victory and celebrate the fact that we are reuniting a lost painting with the heirs of those who suffered so greatly. And that's the ultimate reward for an investigator like me. So again, thank you to Joanna, and thank you to the other panelists, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Chris and Eric. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your service and your expert, careful scrutiny in everything you do. And it teaches us all, certainly museum professionals, how important all those details are. Yeah, people don't realize how important the back of a painting is. It's almost more important than the front. So that was fascinating. Thank you all. I would like to introduce our Belmont's communications manager, Michelle Dolby. She has been previewing questions and comments from our audience, and she might like to be posting some of those questions right now. Michelle.
So just as a reminder to our participants, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So far we've been kind of chatting off and on throughout the program, but we have a question from Victoria, and I'm not sure which of our panelists would like to take this, but she asks, how and when did the painting make it to the US? Who would like to handle that one?
I can take that. It gives me a chance to tell a little bit more about the expropriation of the Mosse family. Rudolf Mosse was a publisher, and at the beginning, right after Hitler became chancellor, there was an effort to restart the German economy, which had suffered tremendous difficulties during the 30s. Part of it were reparations to France and the rest of Europe. And there was this myth that they hadn't actually lost World War I, they were just paying for it. And largely it was the fault of the Jews that they had to do so. And this was part of a populist government, effort inside of Germany, which eventually resulted in Hitler becoming chancellor. But what happened early on, I spoke about the machinations that they had to use to take over the company. The publishing house was one of many companies which were expropriated by the Germans. They took over munitions companies, they took over aircraft companies, and they had targeted the publishing company because of its ability to both its reputation and its ability to spread information. And they expropriated the art, they confiscated the art and listed all of the art that existed in the Mossy Palais in March of 1933. Hitler had become chancellor on January 31st of 1933. And then they auctioned it the next year in 1934. Now, the painting is recorded in the Macbeth Gallery in New York City, I believe, in 1934. So it made a very swift journey from Berlin to the United States. And the painting was purchased by Bartlett Arkell from the Macbeth Gallery and then transferred from his personal collection to the Arkell Museum sometime after that. I hope that answers your question.
Eric, can you say something about who were the go-betweens?
Well, there's a small gap in the provenance in that go-between. There's a gap between the auction, which is known as the Lepke auction in Berlin, and then its arrival in the United States, and then it is next seen publicly in records in the Macbeth Gallery. And so there appears to be a gap between the auction in Germany and its possession by the Macbeth Gallery. It does not appear that the Macbeth Gallery was the actual purchaser of the painting at the Lepke auction. And that is part of the nature of provenance research. Sometimes you don't know.
I thought I saw somewhere that in the Macbeth records that it was consigned to them. From Schulteis Gallery. Are you familiar with that?
So yes, I am familiar with what you're talking about, but we were never able to pin down with absolute certainty that chain.
I see.
And so while we're aware that it may have passed through there, we're not certain.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I have a question just for our viewers. After the restitution ceremony, what happened to Winter after that?
We transferred the artifact, the painting, to Sotheby's, and Sotheby's sold it at auction in December for the benefit of the Massa Art Restitution Project and the 3 heirs. Again, 2 nonprofits and 1 private individual. By the way, I don't personally benefit from any of the restitution efforts. And it was sold for over $100,000.
I have a question. Excuse me, Michelle. I'm just curious if Eric or Roger could tell us, the majority of the works that you've restituted have probably come from public ownership. How successful are you when these works, I mean, the Washington principles don't really apply to works in private hands. So, but how's been your success rate with works that are now privately held?
Well, I'll field that, Roger, and you can add to it after I'm done. So the Washington principles is probably the most interesting aspect of the restitution of Nazi looted art. The Washington principles arise out of the settlement for Swiss gold and goes back to 1998. The United States undertook to manage a process that resulted in the restitution of dormant accounts held in Swiss banks that wrapped up in 1998. And as not a total aside, but as a smaller portion of reaching those accords, they addressed art that had been taken by the Nazi regime, because it's a historical reality. There are differing numbers about how much of the art in Europe the Nazis seized, but they range from a fifth to half. So it's a substantial, even the small end is a seriously substantial amount of art in Europe. What came out of those talks and the settlement with the Swiss gold was the Washington Principles. And the Washington Principles are a non-binding accord to which member states sign. Interestingly enough, in Germany, the Germans went ahead and took those accords and made them part of the legal code for public entities in Germany. So in Germany, German public institutions are bound by the Washington Principles. That's not true in the United States, but we have I would say, a more substantial legal code revolving stolen property, which is, whether it's preferable or not, is sort of up in the air, but it makes for different circumstances. In other parts of Europe, those accord, the Washington Principles are something that there's a whole lot of verbal energy accorded to them, and more or less actual energy in seeking just and fair solutions. And historically, it has gone up and down over time in different countries. A good example of the waxing and waning of interest in the restitution of Nazi looted art would be Holland.
Most of it has been from public institutions, Joanna. However, we have had a few private individuals. One of my favorite was the family. There was a maid that somehow got possession. We believe it was gifted to her some number of books, and she left that to her family from one of the castles that Rudolf Mosse owned. And she volunteered that she had this collection. So we have, in general, the low-hanging fruit is the public institutions, and the harder work will certainly be the private individuals. All 1,000 objects that we've listed, however, make it nearly impossible for a private individual to sell the artifact that they may have that has been stolen on the open market. So that's one of our many challenges in what will be clearly a multi-decade effort.
Excellent. Eric, did you want to say anything more?
Yeah, so the Washington Principles, what Roger just mentioned, that the idea that they exist, given that they're non-binding, they still exist though, and they have created a pressure both on governments and public institutions. And as I've said, it waxes and wanes with the politics of countries over time. But as Roger said, once that art is listed and it's been made public that there is a history that it was looted by the Nazis, it is no longer able to be transferred in a liquid fashion in the international art market. And a lot of people may feel heavily bound to some fancy painting they have on their wall, but the reality is a lot of art from that period is worth quite a bit of money, and a lot of people consider holding art as a way to provide themselves with liquid assets. And that prevents its use in that manner.
Understood. Michelle, do you have any other questions to share?
I do. We have a question for our panelists from Alex. What estimated percentage of fine arts stolen by the Nazis in World War II has been recovered and returned to its rightful owners or descendants?
That's a tough one.
I'm going to venture Very little.
I mean, if you use our own statistics, it's very modest. And you heard Agent McKeogh's talk about, 2 out of 400. So
Sure.
I think it's a very modest number.
And so we've got a ways to go. So where does the Gurlitt or the Schwabing trove stand now? I thought that a lot of those paintings went back to Bern, Switzerland.
So that's an interesting event in both the Mossy Art Restitution Project's work and in German history and in the history of art restitution. Cornelius Gurlitt is the son of a man who was one of 4 men who were enabled by the Nazi regime to trade art across international boundaries during World War II. And so on a historical level, one would assume a great deal of suspicion about art in his possession post the war. The manner in which it came up for investigation post the war was, one can only describe as indirect and accidental. His grandson, I believe it's his grandson, Cornelius, was traveling from Switzerland to Germany and what looked like a suspicious old man. I mean, there's no other question, there's no other way to describe it. There was a border guard on the train, and he looked like a suspicious older white-haired gentleman, and they asked him about his business, and it turned out that he had about 500 euros less than the maximum amount one can transfer over a border without declaration. Everybody may be familiar that when you come back to the United States, you have to sign a little card saying you have less than $10,000 in your possession. The Europeans have a similar rule. You're supposed to declare a certain amount of money. And the guy wrote a report, and the report went down the channels, and they started an investigation about his taxes, and he didn't appear in many of the public rolls, and eventually they moved on to get a search warrant for his apartment, and were quote unquote surprised by the amount of art they found there. Had they done some research in the art community, the art was rather well known. It was no surprise to anybody in the art community in Germany whatsoever. And a magazine called Focus, which is a news magazine in Germany, put out a story about Nazi looted art that was really one could only describe as a sort of slash and burn event, and there must be blood, and we must sell more magazines. Story about how the art was found. It was very sensationalist, not wrong, but focused on the aspects of it that would sell more newspapers and that would elicit embarrassment in the German government and things of that nature. And so, but at the time that came out, we were sitting on, I think, around 15 or 16 pieces of art, which we had identified in museums in Germany. And we'd been sitting around thinking, how are we going to start this conversation with German museums without immediately turning them off? And that solved the problem. It was immediately in their laps. There was absolutely no way they could not have a conversation with us post that event. Recently, they restituted, I believe, the 14th painting from that collection. The collection was over 1,000 items. They've been able to identify and return as well-researched and legitimately identified Nazi looted art, 14 items.
Wow.
The rest of it has gone to this museum in Bern where Cornelius gifted his events. Right. And just how gray everything else is really up in the air, but they're unable to determine where the rest of the art actually originated.
Okay, excellent. Michelle, any more questions?
Yes, we have a question for Roger from Randy. Do you have actual numbers of the pieces that were stolen from the Massa residence? And other than Winter, have any other pieces been recovered and returned to the Massa Foundation? Are there any photographs of the Massa collection in the residence?
It's a lot of questions. Let's see. Let's hit one at a time. First of all, the Rudolf Massa had a number of residences. The two that my family spent time at, one was called Scheckendorf, was kind of a summer residence just outside of Berlin, and one was in Berlin, and actually as a kind of this to the family, Hitler built his office right across the street from the then abandoned building of the exiled family, the Berlin residence, the Massa Palais. We were able to identify over 1,000 objects. It's clear, and I've read stories that there are some 5,000 or 6,000 objects of value, but we've only been able to identify 1,200, which are listed on lostart.de. And as I said, and those were confiscated. Now, what we did have is the benefit of auction catalogs, getting back to good German record keeping, and the auction catalogs from Lepke and Haberstock were very clear on what came from the Massa collection. They advertised them as Massa art. Other than Winter, as I said, we have about 36 restitution efforts that were successful thanks to Eric and John's efforts, leadership, and a lot of investigators and lawyers that have worked with us. We have lawyers in Germany and in the United States, and about 50 artifacts. I have, as a kid, I have seen photographs of the inside of Schenkendorf, which my uncle visited before he took responsibility for selling it. And he was able to show me a photograph of when he was a kid and how it was furnished. I don't know where that photograph is, but I've actually, and yes, there were some of the artifacts that we were able to recover actually in those photographs, but I haven't seen them in a while.
There was also a public event held in the Massa Palais, and my recollection is it's a 1918 international exposition event for which news photographs appear in the Berlin paintings, of which we have those. And there are a series of photographs of both the residences and those events that can be found on Mari's website. So it's the Massa Art Research Initiative. And if you type Massa Art Research Initiative into Google, it should take you to a link that will take you there.
Edward asks, what are the future plans for Winter?
You'd have to
which
ask.
We know was sold. And the owner is anonymous, correct?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Karina asks, so did the people purchasing the art at the auction in Germany realize it was stolen from German families?
Probably, yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting socio-cultural context event. There's everybody knew things were changing and not changing for the good in Germany and in Berlin at that time, and yet a good example of how broad the sort of engagement with those changes and what they meant is that right up until there was no ability to leave, there were Jews who were convinced that things would turn around in Germany, and as we all know, they did not. But there There's no question that there were at least a few people who knew exactly what was going on at that auction. And there's no question that there were many people who probably had some kind of colored spectacles on to justify to themselves that this was a perfectly normal event.
Also, the artifacts that were put through auction, they were very likely combed through by Goebbels and Goering personally before they even got to the auction houses.
We have definitive proof that there were items removed from the collection that did not make it to the auctions.
And that was common for them, those two characters, to cherry pick the best first.
Yeah, not such. There's a not so fun fact on page 52 of a recent biography on Goebbels that Goebbels applied for a job at Berliner Tagblatt and was personally turned down by my step-grandfather, Hans Lachmann, for that job. Kind of an interesting connection.
There are some happy stories. There was another family in Germany. This man ran a steel pipe factory, I believe. And he had 3 Melchers in his possession, but he and his wife and children were able to get out of Germany in the mid-30s with their paintings. And those paintings and the family are here in the United States and protected certainly by our law. So there are some happy stories. Michelle, do you have any other questions?
I have one more. Marcel would like to know if there's any progress on the Dancing Maiden fountain.
Oh boy. Well, Eric.
Roger,
Eric,
would you like to start or shall I?
I'll just do 2 seconds on them, then you can follow. The Smithsonian, on this one artifact, a beautiful sculpture of 6 dancing females, which was owned and was in front of the Mosse residence in Berlin, I believe, we were able to locate it. Eric and his team were able to locate it in Germany at Berg Schlitz, a Relais and Chateau hotel. And we were able to, we thought, prove its provenance to the Mosse family. And the owner would not budge, would not cooperate or discuss with us the future of that artifact or acknowledge that it belonged to the Mosse family. So the Smithsonian magazine took note of this and did a feature article on this one project. And we were hoping that publicity going to the court of public opinion, which so far this project really hasn't focused on, would help us engage the owner. And it did not. And so it's still there waiting for more work to be done. Eric?
So this is an excellent example of the difference in the United States legal system and legal code in the US and in Europe. Given exactly the same circumstances and amount of knowledge that we have regarding the 3 dancing maidens, which are at the Hotel Berg Schlitz just outside of Berlin, I would have, were we in the US and say this was maybe in New York, in the Southern District of New York, I simply would have gone to the Southern District of New York. Or if it was in the Northern District of New York, up in Albany, I would have gone to Chris Moran and Antoinette Bacon's office and asked them for their advice on how to proceed, and presented the information which we possessed. And it's a hypothetical for them, but for me, I have no doubt that they would have done exactly what they did in the case of Winter in regard to the statue. In Germany, it's a little different. We know that the statue, which is a cast, was originally commissioned by Rudolf Mosse. And so the original was at the gates to the Mosse Palais. And in the process of creating the original, the artist also created some 3/4 size replicas. And in that time period, displaying one's art publicly was a big deal. Yeah, we hadn't quite reached the serious sports car era, and so people had fancy fountains in front of their homes. The artist and the fountain were well regarded in the community, and basically what happened, as far as we've been able to discern, is that during the period the Mossy property was expropriated, one of the enablers and advisors to the sort of run up or the sort of command control reignition of the German economy through a movement into arms and ammunition was a director of Deutsche Bank, emailed George von Strauch. And Mr. von Strauch had one of the 3/4 size practice Three Maidens in his yard in Berlin. He did not have the original commissioned fountain that was in front of the Mossy Palais, but he did have the ear of every single German government official associated with the economy, and met regularly with Hitler, met regularly with Schott, who was also behind the economist behind setting up the rebirth of that German economy. And we have notes from a local historian in Berg Schlitz of an interview with an older forester, which records his memory of a wagon arriving from Berlin with the fountain at the hotel. Interestingly enough, the Hotel Berg Schlitz at that period of time was emailed George von Strauss's summer residence. But they have this interview records that the fountain was picked up from a publisher in Berlin and delivered on behalf of a banker to the property.
By the way, one of the replicas is currently legally, as far as we know, in Central Park.
Oh, it's totally legal. It's legally there. It was on one of the sides. One's in Central Park. There's another one in California actually too. They're beautiful fountains. They're really quite stunning. I guess I would describe them as Art Nouveau, but I'd probably be wrong because I'm not that great art historian. I'm better at discovering where things are and how people took them and where they put them. Were I to have the information I have about the fountain at Berg Schlitz in Germany, and it was located in the US, I would absolutely be knocking on the door of the Department of Justice for advice. And those resources just don't exist in Germany.
Right. Thank you very much for that explanation. If you want to read more about that particular story, I believe the Smithsonian issue was June 2018, if you can get a hold of that. I guess it's time to conclude. We are mightily impressed with the expert work and dedication of Roger Strauch and the Mazza Foundation, and Eric's work heading up the Mazza Art Research Project, Restitution Project, and Mari. And so grateful for the hard work and service of the DOJ and the FBI, who are so dedicated to enforcing these very important laws. So thank you very much. And we thank everyone for spending time with us today and appreciate your time with us. Thank you very much.